Hey everybody, it's Jim of Animated Educated, and today you're going to meet Bill Croyer, who's an Oscar-nominated director of animation and computer graphic commercials, short films, movie titles, and feature films, including Tron as a computer image choreographer. And anyway, here he is to tell you more about himself and his new book called Mr. In Between, Bill Croyer.
I find it kind of interesting how it had never occurred to me to be in animation. Growing up in Chicago, I didn't know anybody in it. All through high school, I wasn't allowed to take art because my dad didn't think you could make your living doing that. So all I did was cartoon for the paper. And then I went to Northwestern and I kept cartooning for the school paper because I liked to draw so much and I did political cartoons. And then it literally never occurred to me until I was like junior year of college and I was taking an advertising class. We had to make a 30-second commercial, and everybody else is renting cameras to go out and shoot a commercial. And I thought, hey, what about a cartoon commercial?
Oh,
And I went to the bookstore and I got the Preston Blair book, which was the only book in the entire
uh-huh.
bookstore on animation. That book may have been the most important book in the history of animated film because the entire golden age of anim if you I wrote this book a couple years ago with Tom Sito called The Director's Perspective, right? And it's interviews with all the great animation directors, every one of them. Every single one of them started with that book.
Mhm.
I mean, that's how we all started. It was the only book of its kind at that time. So anyway, I went to the bookstore, I got that book, and I did this little 30-second commercial for the advertising class, and I drew it and I shot it on Super 8 and I sent it to the drugstore and it came back. I was really know what to expect. And then when I ran the film and the little character that I had animated came up and turned around and winked at me and I my head exploded. I went, "Oh my God, I just created life. I just created a living thing." And it was the seminal moment of my whole life. My entire life changed at that moment. From never having even occurred to be in animation to seeing that moment, and suddenly I will never do anything but animation. I mean, how many people have that kind of crystal clear change at 1 second in their life? And that's what happened to me. I just got flipped out. I thought, oh my God, I can create life. And I just started animating, and that was it. That's how I did it.
Did you have a favorite chapter that you wrote about in your book?
Yeah, I'd probably say my favorite chapter was visiting Disney for the very first time. Walking in there with my ponytail and complete rube from Chicago with no experience in animation and having Ed Hansen and Don Duckwall introduce me. I was like amazed. I'm in Disney animation and I'm walking around and I'm seeing all this stuff. And of course, they have no intention of hiring me whatsoever. I am so far, I'm like farthest thing from their mind. It was, it's like, you just that moment when the idiot touches the genius and you're in another world completely. And I just thought that one chapter, you know, easily could have been the end of my career. It could have stopped right there. At the end of that chapter, I literally say everybody turned me down, including Disney, and I'm there. This is it. I mean, literally, if I hadn't gotten that one phone call from Spun Buggy, I probably would have gotten my van and left Hollywood. And I don't know what my life would have been. I don't know what my life would have been.
Hmm.
But that's one of the weird things is I got that, after being turned down by every single studio, there's one guy said, "Well, come on in and how cheap will you work?" And I said, "I will work for anything." And I went in and I started at like, minimum wage doing in-betweens and that was it. That's the only foothold I needed. And then from then on it went. So anyway, that's kind of my favorite chapter. I mean, look, I'm happy to say that I think the book reads more like an adventure story in a way. It's certainly not a history book, because it's a personal experience of Hollywood and just happens to wind your way through all these technological changes and historical changes, artistic changes, the industry changes. And there's a twist and turn in every chapter. So, you know, I have to say I enjoyed writing it. I mean, Sue made me do it. When I got back here to Wisconsin and we had winters, she said, "What are you going to do all winter? Why don't you go upstairs and before you forget everything?" So I went upstairs and I look, I stuck to the business. I could write there's another three or four books of stuff we did outside the business, but I just stuck to the business. And, I think it came out. I'm pretty happy with it.
You talk about working on Tron in the book, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
It was so new. You got to realize that I had never worked on a computer, hardly anyone had, because as I said, there was no computer animation software. So nobody had ever done it. The only thing people were doing with computers were logos, like TV logos and things. That was about it. And doing any kind of sophisticated movement with timing or anything wasn't really a thing at that time. And Jerry Reese and I just had to figure it out. And we not only had to figure it out, we had to figure it out for four different companies. Because remember, Disney had no computers. They hired outside CG studios to do that. And at the time, they had to divide it up because no one studio could come even close to doing the movies. So they had Digital Productions, I mean Triple I doing one part, and they had Robert Abel doing another, and then Digital Productions in New York doing a third, and then Magi doing a fourth. All four of those studios had completely different software setups, completely different hardware. None of them could talk to the other ones, totally incompatible. And the way they all input motion was completely different. So we had to basically, in a way, invent computer animation four different times, you know, and just figure out, okay, well, what do we have to give you guys to get you to understand how this stuff moves? What do we have to supply? And it was pretty primitive. I mean, really, the first thing to do was to storyboard carefully because you really needed to have a pretty accurate visual presentation, what we would now call a pre-visualization, in order for number one, your director, Steve Lisberger, to know exactly what you're intending to produce for him, because the process of doing it was going to be so difficult that revisions would be extremely difficult and expensive, which we couldn't afford. So Steve had to feel comfortable from the start saying, yes, that is what I expect to see. I expect to see the light cycle doing this. I expect to see the recognizer doing that. And you would do these animatics in your storyboard stage. And so at least everybody, you, the director, and the computer company all knew what we were intending to come up with in the end. And then the next thing was okay, how do we best kind of define to these computer people who have no animation skills and no motion skills what timing is, what ease ins and ease outs and arcs and everything else are. And those are the things we did. So the thing that Jerry and I both had, of course, being 2D Disney trained animators, was an ability to not only just visualize, but also draw, what we intended to do, which were really key. And then secondly, we were luckily both of us had that ability to then translate it into numbers. I mean, we both had, and a lot of people didn't have that. A lot of people didn't have the mental flexibility to transfer what was going to be an image into the components that a digital system would comprehend. And luckily, both Jerry and I were able to be, I guess, if you want to call it facile enough, to be able to interpret this into that. And that's how we ended up defining it. Jerry, of course, went on to be extremely innovative, as you know, in the Disney parks. I mean, he's done so much stuff. He's so much new technology. And I think, again, Tron was just the lucky accident that he was the one. I think that's why he sparked to it, because he had a natural interest in it and he also had a natural ability for it, like I did. I just seemed to I was able to do it. I was able to make the adjustment, and that's why it worked. After Tron, as I say in my book, I just became fascinated with the whole idea of computer animation. It was so brand new. It was absolutely no one had done it before, and it was exciting to do it. But after doing it for about 5 years, and from 82 to 87, it was getting a little frustrating that you still couldn't do anything really sensitive, and you couldn't do facial acting or anything. And I was really missing the cartoony aspects of hand drawing. And so I got this idea, well, why don't I just combine the two? Is there a way I can put two of them together? And at the time, digital paint hadn't come along yet, and it was a little harder to do that kind of compositing. But I had this kind of clever idea about just turning computer objects into drawings. And that's what happened. I had a friend, Tim Heidman, who was a terrific software engineer, and I explained the problem to him. I says, can you write a program that will take 3D models and change them into drawings? And he did it. And then we sold a television show based on that called Ultracross, which was a show about these kids who traveled the world disguised as motocross racers solving crimes. We're going to do all the motorcycle races and all with my technique because you could how could you do that with drawing? And we sold that show to Stephen Cannell Productions and started production, and they got a big toy deal with this company. And then the toy company went bankrupt. They had lied about their business model, and when they went bankrupt, Cannell said, "Well, we're not going to make this series if we can't sell toys, and since this company's in bankruptcy court, we can't get the rights back, so forget it." And all of a sudden, we have our computer, we have our software, we have no jobs, and nobody knows what we can do because nobody's ever seen it before. And that's when I said, "Well, let's make a demo and try to think up a story." And I just remembered all my friends coming in and seeing the plotter plot beautiful drawings in like 30 seconds, and they all were looking at that and saying, "Oh my God, this computer's going to replace me." How ironic is that now? And that was the idea. Okay, I'm going to make an office full of cartoony wolves, and they're all getting replaced by computers. And I'm going to animate the wolves by hand, and I'm going to animate the other guys by. And it was a perfect, one of those perfect blendings. And then the movie just, I got all my friends to animate on it and do stuff for free, and we made it by the skin of our teeth, and it became very successful. As a matter of fact, I have to mention this right now. Right behind your head is a poster of the animation
Yeah, right there.
celebration, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We did the animation of that character. You know who animated that shot?
No.
Minkoff.
Oh, really?
Bob
Wow.
Minkoff, director of Stuart Little, director of Lion King. He animated that little globe guy going, "Hey, everybody, it's the world of animation, and you ain't seen nothing yet." And, Rob was a great animator. He did a scene in Technological Threat. He did the scene in Tech Threat where the thing where the guy's getting hit all the time. He keeps holding up
Oh, the
the
different
safe and
things,
the
and he's
anvil and
getting
everything. That's
trapped.
all. That's Rob's scene. Of course, he did it for free. So
Well, I hope you're enjoying this interview with Bill Croyer and learning more about Mr. In Between, the book he's written here. And if you'd like to get this book for free, all you have to do is join this YouTube channel, Animated Educated. Just push that join button, and I will send the first person that does that this book. And now let's get back to the show. So what we're going to see now is actual a maquette that was made by Kathy Zielinski, and they use this to make the owl from Labyrinth, the owl at the beginning where it flies in, and so it's on a pedestal, I guess, made of stone. Oh my God, look how big this thing is! Oh my God, that's huge!
it's huge.
I thought it was little.
No, no, no. It's
Oh my!
it's heavy. There it is.
Oh my gosh!
Kathy Zielinski sculpture of the owl head. It's pretty cool, actually. Look at the detail.
Wow, that's huge.
And of course, the story was in those days, there was no way, it was extremely difficult to create an organic shape like that. I mean, because we were using encoding tables, a flat table that had just a grid in it. And so you would do a front view, side view. So for that, we invented the very first 3D scan I think that was ever done in history. And it was super primitive. We put we just put that sculpture on a record turntable, right? And then we hashed out like 180 little marks, and then we just pointed a 35 millimeter camera at it, and we shined a white line on it. We just took a 35 millimeter slide projector, took a black slide and with a razor blade, just cut a slit so it would project a white line onto the contour of the owl's head. And then we just started taking a picture and rotating it until we had 180 white lines. And then we put all those into the computer and simply asked the computer to distribute those equally in a circle. And then we ended up having what looked like a white bird cage. And then then the computer added the horizontal lines automatically to make polygons. And that's how we ended up with the polygonal shape.
Hmm. Okay.
And then they wrote some software to take that polygonal shape and spread it out, like we called it the roadkill owl. So it spread it out onto a flat image. And then we gave it to a painter, and he painted a photoreal texture of the eyeballs and the beak and the feathers and everything. And then we scanned that, and they simply wrapped it back around onto the polygonal shape. And that's the owl that you see in Labyrinth. And there's a couple of frames. If you stop frame the show, you can see the seam right in the middle of the head where everything radiates from. But that was pretty much, I think, the very first 3D scanned object, was certainly the first 3D scan animal ever done in computer graphics. And it was, I think, the first attempt at a photoreal animal in computer graphics. And it worked pretty well, when you consider how primitive it was. Become a first. This is the very first podcast in history that's ever seen the actual owl head in its glory. But remember how primitive we were, the way we were doing it. You had to have quite a large sculpture to be able to get enough polygonal detail to cover the contours and everything. And you never could have, we just didn't have an ability to do anything, with that kind of detail otherwise. So if you look at the opening titles to Labyrinth, the face does not move at all. It doesn't open its beak. It doesn't do anything. So
Yeah, the flying was great. I mean, you even animated the feathers when it came close and stuff like that. So that was pretty amazing.
oh man, that was a nightmare because I think, what are there, 13 feathers or 14 feathers on an owl wing, and every one of them had to twist and curve and interlock and everything. I'm doing this on a vector machine. Oof, that was
Oh,
tough. That was really
wow.
hard. And we showed up for work one morning and the doors were locked. And everybody was, what's going on? And they said, well, Digital Productions is now owned by Omnibus. Gary and John are gone. What about us? Well, we'll decide. And then I was actually going to Monte Carlo to speak at the Imagina Festival, like the next day. And I left, and while I was gone, they opened the doors for like 2 hours for people to come in and clear out their stuff. So Chris Bailey, who was the only other animator there who I had hired to help me on stuff, he cleared out my desk and then he stole the owl. And he just walks out the door with the owl. And I get back from France and he goes, here, this is your back pay, because they didn't were going to pay us any back pay. So this I have that, and I'm so happy that I got the owl. I'd much rather have that than $150 or something. So anyway, that's how I got the owl. It's Chris Bailey. He swiped it. So there you go.
Do you have any advice for younger people who are getting into animation today?
Because my career was not one where I went to work for Disney and stayed there for 40 years, or went to work for The Simpsons and stayed there for 40 years. I was bouncing around all the time because I was following this weird new opportunity of CG. I was following the excitement of it. And so, and that the result of that was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of failure, a lot of disappointment, but some successes. And I think that's what you have to kind of learn to accept as, the price you pay for being in the arts. It's not gonna go smoothly. The road is never a smooth one. It's an up and down thing. And you have to kind of, at the end of the day, it's always holding true to your own inner belief in not only yourself, but I think your inner, I hate to use that overworked word of passion, but I guess almost like a love and devotion to the art itself. You just like doing it and you feel a lot of self-satisfaction doing it. And when you have that self-satisfaction, you hold yourself to a standard within yourself. You're not as concerned about what other people are saying about your work. You're trying to get better and learn more and do better, and when you do that, it does make you a little bit immune to the ups and downs of criticism and finances. Because at the end of the day, you do have that self-satisfaction and security that what I can control is my love and my interest in my hard work. And I can control that. And, I'm happy to say that animation, I think more than almost any other art form, is one where you can instantly tell the results of that, you know? I mean, when you look at an animated film, you can tell that the artist that made it has skill, and has ability and put work into it. Even an untrained eye could see that. And so I think that's why animation in a lot of ways is I think one of the most satisfying arts that anybody could be in.
You lived in a very interesting house when you were in Burbank.
If you want to see our house, Nightmare on Elm Street 4, Rennie Harlin's, he directed it, Rennie Harlin did it. It's the two best, nightmares are number one and number four. Number one was Wes Craven, which, by the way, I storyboarded. I storyboarded all of Nightmare on Elm Street, the very original one. I did that with Wes Craven and Jim Doyle, the VFX supervisor. I boarded all the horror scenes. And then ironically, they came back and they shot the number four, Rennie Harlin shot it at our house in Burbank. So if you want to see the house that I lived in for 30 some years in Burbank, watch Nightmare on Elm Street 4, and there's the house. Inside and out. They got the inside and out. So,
Wow.
funny thing about that, uh, when we put a bid in on the house, we called Sue's dad in Wisconsin to say, "Oh, we're so excited. We've just put a bid on a house." And he says, "Well, send me pictures." And we said, "You don't have to, just go on and look at Nightmare on Elm Street 4, and you'll see the house." So he pulls it up on the computer and he calls back and he goes, "There's dry rot on the garage door." He's like doing a building inspection on the movies.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I want to thank you for coming on Anime Educated and telling us all about Mr. In Between. Some of the stories that you can find in this book are really interesting and fun.
All right. Well, Jim, it's been great. And it's a lot of fun to be on the show. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I hope people look at the book. It's a lot of fun to read, I think. So,
Yeah, I thought it was good too. Okay, well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Bill Croyer. Definitely go check out his book. If you can't buy it, at least go to the go to that. Go to the website right there. Yeah, go see it right now. I'll wait. Oh, you're back. Okay. And you can get this book if you become a member of this channel. Just push the join button down there. The first person that does that will get this book. As soon as I get your contact information, I'll send it to you. And if you did enjoy this interview in any way, you can press that button right there to subscribe, or you can take a look at other videos I have below. Here's a couple right here, and we'll see you next time on Animated Educated.